If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The axe-wielding man at the hospital. I never thought my quiet little hospital, tucked away in a sleepy town, would be the setting for the most terrifying night of my life. I was working the late shift, something I'd grown used to over the past year as a new nurse. It was a slow night, only a couple of patients in the ER, the usual post-op checks, and a coffee machine that never seemed to brew fast enough. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the empty hallways as I sat behind the desk, flipping through charts to keep myself awake. That's when I noticed him through the glass doors at the entrance. At first glance, he looked like any other visitor. Tall, scruffy, wearing a flannel jacket and jeans. But then I saw the axe in his hand. He walked in like he belonged there, like the axe wasn't the most bizarre thing about this situation. His expression was what froze me in my chair. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But there was this emptiness in his eyes that felt even more dangerous. My first instinct was to grab the phone and call security, but our security guard was on break in the cafeteria at the far end of the hospital. My hands trembled as I picked up the receiver and dialed for him. Before I could even get a word out, the man spotted me. His gaze locked onto mine, and the corners of his mouth twitched into a smile that made my stomach turn. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, holding the phone like it was a lifeline. The man took a step toward the desk, dragging the axe along the tiled floor with a screech that sent shivers down my spine. I managed to stammer out a call to the security guard, but before he could respond, the man turned abruptly and started walking toward one of the locked supply rooms down the hall. That's when the first swing came. The sound of the axe hitting the reinforced door was deafening, like a crack of thunder in the otherwise silent hospital. Panic set in as the realization hit me. He was trying to break into the supply room where the controlled substances were stored. I fumbled for the PA system and managed to blurt out, "Code Silver, main floor," hoping to alert anyone nearby. The nurses in the ER must have heard it because they came rushing out, their faces pale with fear. Dr. Patel, one of the on-call doctors, appeared moments later, his usually calm demeanor replaced with something I can only describe as determined fear. He took one look at the man hacking away at the door and muttered, "We need to barricade this hallway now." We quickly started moving whatever we could find, rolling carts, chairs, even a heavy filing cabinet, to block off the hallway leading to the patients' rooms. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The man wasn't saying anything, just grunting with every swing of the axe. The sound of metal and wood splintering under the force of his blows was unbearable. One of the nurses, Maria, was trying to keep calm as she helped, but her hands were shaking so much that she nearly dropped a cart. Dr. Patel grabbed her shoulders and whispered something I couldn't hear before turning to me. "The police are on their way," he said firmly, though the look in his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. The barricade felt flimsy at best, and every crash of the axe made me flinch. From behind us, the faint sound of crying began to echo down the hall. One of the ER patients, a teenage girl with a broken arm, had wandered out of her room, her face streaked with tears. Maria ran to her and ushered her back inside, but it was a stark reminder of how exposed we all were. I couldn't stop imagining what would happen if the man got through. We were trapped, and it felt like time was dragging on forever. The only thing giving me hope was the distant sound of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. Just when I thought the door couldn't take another hit, it gave way with a deafening crash. The man let out a guttural yell, like he'd finally won some twisted game. I could see into the supply room now. Shelves toppled over, the reinforced lock mechanism dangling uselessly from the frame. He stepped inside, swinging the axe wildly, knocking things over like a man possessed. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't turn around and notice us at the end of the hall. Dr. Patel motioned for us to stay quiet, his eyes darting between the barricade and the supply room. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. The sirens were louder now, almost at the parking lot, but it didn't feel fast enough. The man started dragging boxes of medication out into the hallway, his movements frantic and unpredictable. That's when he finally spotted the barricade we had hastily thrown together. His face twisted into something primal, and he started toward us, dragging the axe again. "Get behind me," Dr. Patel ordered, stepping forward with nothing but his clipboard in hand. My stomach dropped. The rest of us shrank back, helpless. The sound of the axe scraping closer and closer was enough to make my knees buckle. I thought for sure we were done for. What happened next felt like it played out in slow motion. Just as the man reached the barricade and raised the axe to swing, Dr. Patel lunged forward. He grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher, something I hadn't even noticed, and sprayed it directly into the man's face. The hiss of the extinguisher and the cloud of white foam filled the air, making it impossible to see for a moment. The man staggered back, coughing and swinging the axe blindly, but the foam disoriented him. Dr. Patel didn't waste a second. He charged forward and tackled the man, knocking the axe out of his hands. They both hit the floor hard, and the axe clattered across the tiles, stopping inches from my feet. It took all my strength not to scream as the man thrashed wildly, trying to throw Dr. Patel off him. Maria and I ran forward, instinctively kicking the axe away as far as we could. Somehow, Dr. Patel managed to pin the man down, his knee pressed into the guy's back while he kept his arms locked. "Call the police," he shouted over his shoulder, his voice hoarse. I grabbed the phone and gave them the update, barely able to get the words out between shaky breaths. Moments later, the first officer burst through the doors, gun drawn. Relief washed over me so fast it made my legs weak. The man was cuffed and dragged away, still shouting incoherently, his face smeared with extinguisher foam. When the police finally had him restrained and taken out of the building, the silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the chaos had been. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, feeling like my body had turned to jelly. Maria was crying softly, and Dr. Patel was leaning against the desk, his chest heaving. None of us said a word for what felt like forever. The officers started asking questions, but their voices felt muffled, like I was underwater. All I could think about was the way the man had smiled at me when he first walked in, as if he'd planned all of this for us. The police told us later that the man was a drifter who had a history of violent outbursts, though they couldn't explain why he'd chosen our hospital that night or why he seemed so fixated on the supply room. It didn't feel like enough of an answer. Even now, months later, I still wake up at night to the sound of that axe hitting the door. Sometimes, I catch myself looking over my shoulder at work, half expecting to see him standing there with that empty look in his eyes. It's the kind of fear that doesn't go away, no matter how many locks or security measures you put in place. The psychotic roommate in the psychiatric ward. When I checked into the voluntary psychiatric unit, I wasn't expecting a vacation, but I also didn't expect how suffocating it would feel. The walls were this pale, institutional yellow, and the air always carried the faint smell of bleach mixed with old coffee. They paired me with a roommate named Jane, who seemed fine at first. Quiet, maybe a little too quiet, but I figured that was better than having someone loud or overly chatty. She kept to her side of the room, head bent over a crossword puzzle, scribbling away in silence. I introduced myself briefly, but she just nodded and gave me this half-smile before going back to her puzzle. I didn't think much of it then. The first couple of days passed without much incident, though I started noticing small, odd details about her. For one, she never seemed to finish that damn crossword. Every time I glanced over, it was the same one, and her pen hovered over the same squares. She'd mutter softly to herself, words I couldn't quite make out. At night, she'd toss and turn, whispering things like, "No, not yet," or "I can't." I chalked it up to the stress of being in a place like this. We were all here for a reason, after all. But then, things started getting weirder, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, I woke up to the sound of shuffling in the dark. At first, I thought it was just a nurse doing rounds, but then I noticed Jane standing in the middle of the room, staring at the door. She was clutching her crossword book tightly, her knuckles white. I whispered, asking if she was okay, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, muttering something under her breath. Her voice was low, almost guttural, and it didn't sound like words anymore, just noises. After a few moments, she shuffled back to her bed, crawled under the covers, and went silent. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the image of her standing there, her silhouette outlined by the hallway light spilling in through the window. Then, I started noticing things going missing. Small, seemingly insignificant items like my toothbrush or the book I had been reading. At first, I thought maybe I had misplaced them, but then I found my hairbrush under her bed, wrapped in a sheet of paper with her crossword puzzle on it. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She just looked at me, her face completely blank, and said, "I needed it." That was it. No apology, no explanation. I didn't push it, but that was the moment I started feeling genuinely uneasy around her. Something about her was off, beyond just the usual struggles people in a place like this might have. Things escalated a few nights later. I woke up to Jane whispering again, but this time it was louder, almost like she wanted me to hear. "Help me," she kept saying, over and over, her voice barely above a whisper. At first, I thought she was talking in her sleep, but when I turned to look at her, she was sitting upright in her bed, staring directly at me. Her eyes were wide, almost unblinking, and her face was pale in the dim light. "Help me," she said again, louder this time. I sat there frozen, not knowing what to say or do. Then she tilted her head to the side, smiled in this strange, almost mechanical way, and laid back down without another word. I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I told one of the nurses what happened. They assured me they'd check on her, but Jane seemed completely normal during breakfast. She even smiled at me, like we were friends. I almost felt like I'd imagined the whole thing, but later that day, I found another one of my belongings tucked into her bed, my journal, with half the pages ripped out. The nurses didn't seem to take me seriously when I told them. "She's just having a hard time," one of them said, like that explained everything. But I knew something wasn't right. That night, I decided to stay awake and see if anything else happened. That night was when everything truly spiraled. Around 2 a.m., I heard a loud thud coming from Jane's side of the room. I bolted upright and saw her on the floor, crouched like an animal, tearing apart her crossword book with her bare hands. She was breathing heavily, almost growling, and muttering, "It's wrong, it's all wrong." I stayed frozen in my bed, terrified to move or make a sound. She suddenly stopped, snapped her head toward me, and stared. Her eyes looked wild, unfocused, and there was this faint smear of red across her cheek. I wasn't sure if it was ink or blood. She crawled toward me on her hands and knees, dragging the torn crossword pages with her. I thought I was going to pass out from fear. She stopped at the foot of my bed and whispered, "You see it too, don't you?" I had no idea what she meant, but the way she said it made my stomach drop. I managed to mutter something about needing the bathroom and scrambled out of the room. I went straight to the nurses' station and begged them to come check on her. They seemed annoyed at first, like I was overreacting, but when they entered the room, they found Jane sitting on her bed, rocking back and forth with the crossword pages spread out around her like a shrine. She was humming a strange, tuneless melody. They called for backup, and within minutes, orderlies arrived to escort her out. She didn't resist, she just smiled at me as they took her away. The room felt eerily quiet after they took Jane away. I expected to feel relieved, but instead, this heavy unease settled over me. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she smiled as they led her out, like she knew something I didn't. The nurses tried to reassure me, saying she'd been moved to the involuntary ward for more intensive care, but they wouldn't tell me anything beyond that. I asked if I could switch rooms, but the unit was full, so I had no choice but to stay. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, convinced I'd hear her voice again or see her face at the window. The next morning, I found something she'd left behind, one of her crossword puzzles, tucked under my pillow. Only this time, the puzzle wasn't blank. It was completely filled in with random letters and symbols, like a madman had scribbled all over it. In the corner, she'd written, "It's not over." My hands started shaking so badly I dropped the paper. I showed it to a nurse, but she just gave me this dismissive smile and said, "It's probably just part of her condition. Don't let it get to you." Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one sleeping in that room. Over the next few days, small, inexplicable things kept happening. I'd wake up to find the lights flickering or my bed slightly moved, like someone had been tugging at it. Once, I swore I heard faint humming from the hallway, the same tuneless melody Jane used to hum. When I mentioned it to the staff, they told me I was imagining things, that it was probably my nerves. But I knew what I heard. One night, I decided to confront whatever was going on. I stayed awake, sitting up in bed, determined to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. That's when I saw it. Something small but unmistakable. My crossword puzzle book, the one I hadn't touched in days, was sitting in the middle of the floor, open to a blank page. I hadn't put it there. I don't know what Jane left behind in that room, some lingering energy, or maybe just the weight of everything that happened, but I knew I couldn't stay. I asked for a discharge the next morning, and thankfully, they approved it. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there somewhere, watching or waiting. I still have nightmares about her crawling across the floor, or that awful smile she gave me as they dragged her away. And every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can hear her voice whispering, "Help me." The fake midwives. It all started around mid-afternoon, 2 weeks after bringing my baby girl home. I was still in that foggy postpartum haze, exhausted but so protective of her that I hadn't slept properly since she was born. When the doorbell rang, I almost ignored it, but then I remembered the hospital had mentioned that midwives sometimes made home visits to check on newborns. Through the peephole, I saw 2 women in scrubs, holding clipboards and wearing those laminated ID badges. They smiled in that overly professional way, the kind that made you feel stupid for doubting them. I didn't think twice before opening the door, something I still kick myself over. As soon as they stepped inside, though, something felt off. They didn't bother introducing themselves or explaining the visit, just went straight into asking questions. "How's she feeding? Are you breastfeeding?" One of them asked, her eyes darting past me toward the living room where my daughter was in her bassinet. The other one barely said a word, but her eyes scanned the house like she was taking inventory. I noticed their scrubs didn't have a hospital logo, and their ID badges hung awkwardly, like props. My gut clenched, but I forced a smile and answered their questions while positioning myself between them and my baby. The questions kept coming, but they felt weirdly generic, like they weren't really interested in the answers. "Do you keep her nursery clean? Have you noticed any rashes?" One of them asked if I had a routine for sterilizing bottles, but I don't use bottles yet, only breastfeeding. When I said that, her expression didn't change, almost like she wasn't listening at all. Meanwhile, the quieter one inched closer to the bassinet, glancing at me only when she thought I wasn't looking. I suddenly felt exposed, like I'd let strangers into my most vulnerable space. My hands started sweating, but I tried to keep calm, holding my baby against my chest like a shield. "Do you have any paperwork or authorization for this visit?" I finally asked. That's when their demeanor shifted. The chattier one smiled, but it was tight, almost annoyed. "We're just doing our job," she said, glancing at her partner. "It's standard procedure." But that didn't explain why they hadn't shown me any ID or why their questions felt so rehearsed. My gut was screaming now. I stood up, making it clear that the visit was over. "I'll call the hospital to confirm," I said, moving toward the door. The quiet one suddenly froze and grabbed the clipboard like she was ready to leave, but the other woman didn't budge. She leaned in slightly and said, "It's important we check the baby for any signs of neglect. Some mothers don't realize they're not doing enough." That last comment made my stomach drop. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said it, like she was trying to rattle me. My heart started pounding, and I held my daughter tighter, refusing to let her out of my arms. "You need to leave," I said, as firmly as I could manage, though my voice was shaking. The quieter woman looked at her partner, clearly waiting for her cue. For a second, I thought she might argue or push back, but then she just shrugged and muttered, "Fine, but you're making this harder on yourself." They started moving toward the door, but so slowly that it felt like they were stalling. I stayed close behind them, praying they'd just walk out. As soon as they stepped outside, I slammed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a second to twist the lock properly. Through the peephole, I saw them standing on the porch, whispering to each other. One of them turned and gave the door a hard look, like she was sizing me up. Then they walked off down the street, not to a car or another house, just walking. My legs felt like jelly as I grabbed my phone and called the hospital, desperate to confirm whether they'd sent anyone. When the receptionist told me they had no record of any midwives scheduled for visits, I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. After hanging up with the hospital, I immediately called the police. My voice was trembling as I explained what had happened, giving them every detail I could remember. What they looked like, what they were wearing, even how they acted. The officer on the line sounded concerned and told me they'd send someone to check the area. While I waited, I kept pacing the living room, my daughter still cradled in my arms. Every creak of the floorboards or sound from outside made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that they might come back, maybe with someone else. My curtains were still open, and I rushed to close them, suddenly feeling exposed in my own home. When the police arrived, I expected some kind of reassurance, but their questions only made me feel worse. Did they try to take the baby? Did they touch her? Did they say anything specific about why they were there? The answer to all of that was no, but their presence still felt so wrong. One officer looked genuinely unsettled when I mentioned the lack of hospital logos on their scrubs or how their badges seemed fake. They promised to patrol the neighborhood and advised me to stay alert and call immediately if I saw them again. After they left, I sat on the couch, clutching my baby and staring at the door like it was going to swing open any second. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd picture those two women, their stiff smiles and the way they kept glancing at the baby like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. I kept replaying their visit over and over in my mind, trying to figure out what they wanted or what they were planning to do. Were they trying to kidnap her? Were they casing the house for some other reason? The more I thought about it, the less it made sense, but one thing was clear: they weren't midwives. I kept my daughter in bed with me, the door locked and a heavy chair shoved under the handle. I even stayed up scrolling through my phone, searching for similar stories, but I didn't find anything that matched. The next morning, I got a call from the police. They said they'd patrolled the area but hadn't found anyone matching the descriptions I gave them. No reports of other suspicious activity, no signs of the women. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. The officer on the phone tried to reassure me, but I could tell he was frustrated. "It could have been a scam," he said. "Maybe they were looking to steal something or get your information." But that didn't explain why they seemed so focused on my baby. By the time the call ended, I felt more uneasy than ever, like I'd dodged something terrible without fully understanding what it was. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every knock at the door, every shadow passing the window sent me into a spiral. I stopped answering the door completely, even for deliveries. My husband, who'd been working out of town, rushed home as soon as I told him what happened. He was furious, angry at the situation, at the hospital for not warning us about imposters, and probably even at me for letting them in. But he tried to reassure me, insisting that it was probably just a random scam and that they were long gone. I wanted to believe him, but my gut told me otherwise. I started noticing little things, like the way our mailbox was slightly ajar one morning or how our garbage bins were moved closer to the house than we'd left them. The final straw came 3 nights later. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then came a soft tapping on the glass. My blood turned to ice. I didn't dare move, afraid they'd realize I was awake. I just lay there, clutching my daughter and listening. The tapping stopped after what felt like an eternity, and I finally mustered the courage to peek out through the edge of the curtain. There was no one there, but the grass below the window was flattened, like someone had been standing there for a while. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of anyone. Since that night, nothing else has happened, but I can't shake the lingering fear. I installed cameras around the house and started triple-checking every lock before bed. Every time I review the footage, part of me expects to see those women again, standing on the porch or worse, near the windows. I've played it over 1,000 times in my head. What if I'd handed them my baby for some inspection? What if I'd stepped into the kitchen to grab a bottle or let them out of my sight for even a second? The what-ifs are endless, and they haunt me more than the encounter itself. The police have no leads, the hospital had no explanation, and I'm left with this unsettling void of unanswered questions. I still wonder who they were and what they wanted. Were they criminals, or something worse? I've read stories about human trafficking, baby snatching, even cults targeting new mothers, but nothing adds up. The strangest part is how it just stopped. No follow-ups, no strange cars parked outside, no more knocks at the door. It's like they disappeared, leaving me in a state of constant paranoia. To this day, I can't relax in my own home, and every time I hear the doorbell, my stomach turns. I'll never know what their intentions were, but one thing's certain, I'll never let a stranger through my door again.